Alrighty, this is part 3. We're gonna jump right in. Marilyn, did you paint one of these? Phil, I painted the 3 over there on the wall, and these 3 here. Joe, unbelievable. All 3 begin speaking at the same time. Marilyn. Okay, these 2 were painted a year ago, and Dr. Callahan painted these 3. Phil, my grandmother willed me those 2 pictures. She knew I wanted them, so when she died, those were in her estate. I told her I had to have them, and so I got them when she died. She was fairly wealthy, inherited a lot of money from him. Joe, the Spanish did a book on birds. They found that birds were animals that would eat certain seeds. The seeds would grow on certain environmental soils. Video cuts out a few seconds. Phil, birds they eat certain seeds. Marilyn, to the camera. The Spanish inherited, just all talking at the same time. Joe, that's how they found ajo, or ajo, means garlic. Oh, ajo, yeah, or ajo, means garlic in Spanish. That's how they found the copper. Marilyn, and this is the view from the porch. Beautiful country. Takes the video camera to show a panoramic view out the front door. The camera focuses on a sign above the door, Dad's workshop, which is the garage behind the house. Phil, everybody that goes there wants to go back. Joe, how much time? Phil, because Ireland has a real good tourist bureau. The tourists really help you out. Joe, after the Dark Ages, actually, was the depository of all the Catholic religion. Rome got so corrupt that... Phil, Ireland and Scotland and all the ancient histories, there's a book about that called How Ireland Saved the World. They wanted to save the world. Joe, Ireland did something with these big, on top of these mountains. Phil, yeah, right. Let me just make sure I'm recording. All right. Joe, it's paramagnetic. Sure, they catch that water there for their farms. Yeah, they know how to irrigate. Joe, they actually harvested. They took it right out of the earth. Phil, they knew how to irrigate the terrain. They did the experiment under them. They catch the water. Yeah, they know how to irrigate. Joe, they actually harvest. Joe, I think maybe somehow or other we lost a lot of stuff in history of value. Phil, my dog's scratching right next to me. You hear these things. All right. Abby, quiet down. Joe, they actually harvest. Joe, I think maybe, okay, we lost a value. Phil, they went to high technology and poisoned everything, which it's changing now, though. I got it changed pretty well. The Department of Agriculture is changing it completely. They've gone strictly towards organic farming now. Joe, anyone that's really done any studying with ecology, you never really had the following that you should have had with these Greenpeace and all these other, a lot of them were money. You never really had. Phil, Greenpeace had enough money and it started out good. They didn't have any use for it either. They didn't even try. Joe, it broke loose. Phil, it broke loose. Yes. Joe, I haven't even talked to you about the depleted uranium and all these perchlorate that's coming out of every military base. Perchlorate is scaring the hell out of people. Phil, it's poisons. It's what they're doing. Joe, every base in this country has just loaded the cities around them with the perchlorates. Phil, what do you say as to how these perchlorates work? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing... Oh, it's perchlorates. I didn't even see the R. I'm pretty far from the screen. Perchlorates. Maybe it's perchlorates. We'll see. Joe, they believe it's coming out of the fuels, the jet fuels. Phil, yeah, it's coming out of the jet fuels. Joe, and all this other stuff. Phil, so it's poisoning the atmosphere. Joe, yeah, up in the air and they're coming down. Maybe these chemicals and all this other stuff. Phil, they can clean that up, but they don't want to put any money into that. They don't mind putting it up there. They won't pay to clean it up. Joe, I think you can clean clean it up with these microbes, like what Turo Higa was doing with these effective microbes. Phil, it's real simple. It wouldn't cost much. Joe, where these pig farms and chicken ranches and where all the stuff and where all that stuff is, all that nitrogen is real good. You worked it with a little carbon and you work with it, Phil, and then you'd clean it off. It'd be real easy. Joe, that's what I want to talk to you a little about, to Marilyn. Are you ready? Marilyn, Joe, come over here and talk a little bit more, and then when you get tired, just holler, and I'm not going to wait another year to come over to talk. Next time I'm going to see you before that. Phil, come over anytime you want. The advantage of being retired, as it doesn't make any difference when you come. Joe, I thought I'd retire, but I just got too tired. Marilyn and Joe laugh. Marilyn to Phil, you can go in there and she can clean up in here. Joe, you can come back and talk about anything you want. Phil goes into the other room so that his wife can clean. The interview continues after he's rested. Continued. Phil, Christopher Bird went there. The reason he went there is because he is Jewish and he had to pray to the Virgin Mary. The day after he prayed to the Virgin Mary, the Gestapo was after him. The Gestapo kind of opened up and he went through their lines. He went through the German lines without ever had been touched. He went clear across Germany. They never caught him. They wanted him real bad because he was a real religious guy and he spoke out. He was a Jewish guy. He was speaking out for the Catholic people to get up and fight Hitler. But he went right through their lines, and when he got the words, he thanked the Virgin Mary for their words. He wrote a book, a famous book about the words, and it was written by a Jewish guy. It's called Saint Bernadette, of course. It sells copies every year. The camera cuts off. Phil, he could change electronics, the world. Joe, well, HARP and all these other things, that's his stuff. It's not Eastman's, it's Tesla. Phil, yeah, that's Tesla. He did it all. When you go back, you find out he started every bit of it. Joe, where'd he get his knowledge? How'd he get it? How'd he tune in? Phil, he'd say he was very spiritual and that it came from God. Same way I guess you'd say it was insight, I guess is what you call it. He could just look at something and an idea would flash in front of his eyes. Joe, Tesla believed that he could actually talk to the ETs. Phil, sure. Joe, he believed he could talk to people further than Mars. Phil, there's no doubt he could. I doubt he was talking to people on Mars. Joe, there's no doubt he could. Okay, Joe, he said he was. Phil, well, if you rephotograph Mars with that 50-watt transmitter, that means by the time the energy reaches Mars, which is 129 million miles away, so if you got a 50-watt transmitter, by the time that energy gets back to the receiver, it's 10 to the minus 27 watts. You can't even say that. It's 27 zeros. You can't even say that number. It's a trillion of a trillionth of that little watt what you tune to. That's how sensitive our electronics is today. So there's no problem at all photographing Mars or anything else. They're photographing other galaxies now by sending up satellites to photograph them. Joe, Armin Bickel, he's still out of the Lompoc. He's about 90 years old now. Phil, he's pretty old. Joe, I went to visit him a couple times and even brought a Bickel machine from him. I paid about $5,000 for that machine, and I think your CGS machine does the same thing a bit better. It's a little easier to understand, and you don't have to have a scientist and a PhD to run it. Joe, yeah, I know that. I'm sorry, Phil, yeah, I know that. Joe, and Vogel had a machine. I think he called it the Omega 5. I got out of his machines. I got one of the machines. Phil, they're all CGS meters. Joe, and they are CGS meters. And I got a hold of your unit, and I had a hell of a time keeping it. Phil, CGS is a good name for it. Centimeters, grams per second. You just described it, you know. Real simple. It always works. About the only expensive thing in my meters is the two coils at $50 a coil. They have to be wound in Germany. The Germans are the only ones that wind good coils. So I just get the coils from Germany because they have to be perfectly matched. Joe. Jourdain Boyce was doing the same thing with the iron that you were doing over 100 years ago, but he was measuring it with a Wheatstone bridge, and he was trying to get the efficiency between the two. Phil, yeah, that's right. That's all a CGS meter is, a primitive CGS meter. Joe, that's all it is. It's a primitive CGS meter. Phil, it's a CGS with a Wheatstone bridge. I'm not lying when I say there's a little bit difference, but not much. Joe picks up a photograph of a B-24 and brings it in view for the video camera. Phil, smiling. That's my aircraft. I'm real proud of that. The B-24. I parachuted out that thing. I wouldn't parachute out a B-17. The bomb bay wasn't big enough. You could almost hit your head on the side of the thing when you went out. I jumped behind German lines 2 times, I think. I got out of it every time and they couldn't figure it. I'm still cheating death. Joe, see, I don't think I could get out of B-24. Excuse me. The equipment man, turning it, had no, it's a B-25. Phil, turning it, I think his name was, it was a B-24. Joe, no, it's a B-25. Phil, a B-25 is a little bitty plane. Joe, a B-25 is so oily and messy. It's scary. Phil, it's a monster. A B-25 is twice as noisy as the big old thing. The big old thing is quiet. Joe, a B-25. I flew out from Tucson to Phoenix, and I was a Christian by the time I got to Phoenix. Phil, when you want to do, what you want to do is sit in the radio compartment. You gotta crawl through the tunnel. Yeah, I was back in the radio compartment a lot of the time when I flew in those things. There was no way out of it. Everybody would parachute out, would parachute out of there, but the radio man, he was just stuck there, so that's where I hid. Joe, took you to the top. Phil, every time I got stuck in a B-25, I'd say the rosary. Joe, makes a Christian out of you. Phil, yeah, made a Christian out of me. You're dead by then. I hated that thing. Points to the picture. That was the B-24. Joe, they called that the Liberator. Phil, The Liberator was a B-24, yeah, the B-24 Liberator. Joe, and the 2 tails? Phil, best plane ever made. That thing, if you lose 3 engines, you can still land it. You can land that thing with 1 engine. It had 4 engines on them. You can land with 1 engine. Joe, it had a glide path. Phil, yeah, stretches his arm out to demonstrate. It had 12-degree glide path so it could settle down. The 12-degree angle was real easy. You could cut the power off. I cut it off a couple times, but never landed it with the power off. I almost had to land it like that, powerless. It was in too great shape. Joe, Halsey was really worried about the terrorists affecting our water and food. Phil, yeah, that figures. Joe, and the food's coming in from Mexico and other places, and they got the DDTs that we were supplying to them down there. Phil, in Mexico, they threw DDT around like it's nothing, and they still do. Joe, and he was worried about that was happening to the future generations of people. And he was worried about what was happening to the future generations of people, our kids and our kids' kids. Phil, it wreaks havoc on our reproductive systems. In Mexico, that's for sure. Paramagnetism fixes the reproductive system of insects, and it'll sure do it on people too if you give it a chance. Otherwise, the DDT eventually causes sterilization. Joe, Mrs. Carson wrote the book A Silent Spring. Rachel Carlson. Phil, Silent Spring. Yeah. Joe, I had that thing. What is that Silent Spring? Let me just put it here for later. Oh, let's just see now, I guess. Environmental Science book published in 19. The book documented the environmental harm by indiscriminate pesticides. Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. Phil, Silent Spring. Yeah. Joe, I think the thing that really caught the people was the fact about what it was doing to birds. Phil, really important. Yeah, they did it. That did it. Everybody loves birds. That did it. But birds, Joe, the way birds go is about the way civilization is going to go too. I believe that if when we were talking about the canaries in the mines, there's a possibility that birds can tell you what to eat and what to drink water. Phil, sure, Joe, and the air that we're breathing. Phil, when I go out in the woods, I don't usually take much with me. I just watch what the birds eat and I just eat the same thing. You can get it anywhere. Grass seeds. I'm real big on grass seed. You just shake the seed off and throw it into a tin cup. Build a fire and make a mush out of it. I lived for weeks and weeks in Germany taking no food at all. I just lived on grass seed. Joe, sounds a little like Yule Gibbons, doesn't it? Phil, yeah, chuckles. Joe, but anyway, you went on your expeditions and had practically nothing with you. You just took a tiny little survival pack. Why don't you describe your survival pack? Phil, yeah, I had a little knapsack. I still got it somewhere. It's that little blue knapsack. It weighed about, I never carried more than 20 pounds in it. All I had in it was a down jacket so I wouldn't freeze to death, and a trowel. A garden trowel for digging up insects, grubs. That's really all I carried in it was a tin cup and a down jacket and a garden trowel. Probably weighed 4 or 5 pounds. Joe, you never took any defensive weapons? You never take a knife? Phil, no. I had a pocket knife for whittling, and mostly I'd use it to whittle sticks. If I wanted to roast something, I'd whittle a stick out and put a point on it. Oh, I still got my pocket knife somewhere. Joe, I'd seen a Swiss knife on top of the. Phil stands up and finds the knife on top of the shelf of a bookcase, not more than 3 feet away. As he describes the knife, he opens out each part of the knife. The camera zooms with a close shot of books on the middle shelves. Book titles that can be seen indicate parrots, birds and prey, and falcons. Phil, I still got it. It's got everything you need in it. It's got a blade. It's got a corkscrew in case you got a bottle champagne. It's got a Phillips screwdriver. Everything's got a Phillips head on it. It's got a regular screwdriver. It's got a can opener. It's a Swiss knife. It's a Swiss Army knife. That's it. That's all you need is a Swiss Army knife and a tin cup. He folds the last part of the knife in. Joe, they won't even let you get on an airplane with that anymore. Phil, no. What I do is I usually put it in I got a little sack I usually carry. He places his hand over to the right of his hip where it would go. Then he stands up again to show where he places the knife. Phil, I put it in there and they just throw in the luggage compartment. It goes through that machine, and when they say there's a knife, I say it's going in the luggage compartment. It's no problem. They just throw it in the luggage compartment and give it back to me when I leave. There's no problem with the airlines. They're reasonable. I never have any trouble with them. I don't care. It's in the luggage compartment. They never lost anything of mine. Joe, you ever been in a place you didn't think you wouldn't get out? You ever been really close to God? Phil, yeah, 3 times. I bailed out over Germany occupied France. I thought I wouldn't get out, but I did. Usually I'd steal a Jeep. I'd bail out and do what I had to do, and mostly collect data and send it back to headquarters. Then I'd just steal a Jeep. Another Jeep. The biggest ride I've had was from Munich to Marlina and back to my radio station from Marlina. It was 652 miles. One time I went from Marlina the other way. I went from Marlina to Balik, which was 3 miles. From Balik, I went to Belfast. From Belfast, I went to Lareen, which is off the coast of Ireland, where I cross over the wall around to Scotland, which is a strand that rises over the port of Scotland. From there, I went to Manchester, England, then south to Bilberg. And then from there, I'd cross the English Channel from Bilberg to Callahan. Joe, you were in a hostile country there in England. I mean, there was the Irish, the English, the Scots, and everybody was fighting. Phil, yeah, Yeah, well, I was on the border there. That was IRA. They hated my guts. The IRA was about, well, every teenager born to the IRA was dangerous, but they wouldn't tell you because that was a big deal. But 15 or 20 of them were, and they were fanatics. They tried to kill me 2 or 3 times. Joe, your job there was to maintain contact with the pilots using radio beams in order to guide them back safely. Phil, it was a 100-watt radio station sitting up in the E-mound. The transmitters were as big as that wall over there, points behind Joe. They were huge and they had coils in them like that forms a circle almost the size of a hula hoop with his long arms. Very dangerous. Joe, you were all there by yourself. No help. Phil, no help at all. Joe, it would ice up. You had to knock all that ice off. Phil, when you were a radio commando, you train as a radio commando. That's your job. If anybody tried to knock it off, you'd have to kill them. You'd keep going and kill anyone that tries to knock it off the air. Joe, the Germans tried to triangulate you and tried to find you all the time. Phil, oh yeah, and they tried it. They tried to find me. I outwitted the Germans. I outwitted Germans and the IRA. They tried to find the station all the time. I had a parrot that would start saying, "How you doing?" as soon as anyone got close. And when the parrot would start saying, "How you doing?" I'd just go out in the woods. I had my 45. Took it in my bag here, points to his hip. I never used it. The Germans would come by and look at it, the radio station. They wouldn't even know what it was. They were so stupid. The Nazis would come look at it and never blew it up. They didn't even know what it was. They thought it was a broadcast station for the news. They thought they were putting out news for Good Morning America or something. Chuckles. Joe, I don't know if I understand you or not, but the Germans would send out 2 beams, and when the German planes would fly, they'd find those beams and could zero in where they crossed, and that's where they dropped their bombs. Phil points his 2 index fingers outward and crosses one over the other. So what I did was send out another beam so that it crossed over the countryside in cow pastures where they dropped all their bombs. They never hit London. They never dropped a single bomb on London. Joe, and all of it was secret. You'd never tell anyone about what you were doing because, Phil, as soon as I get the Medal of Honor, we'd probably find out that the British were going to give me a Victorian Cross and the Jewish people were going to give me a medal for shooting if I ever get a document out of them or so. I drove 652 miles from Marlina to Germany and crashed through the gates of Dachau, Germany. I remember I did it and came back all through enemy territory. Joe chuckles. Well, things got boring. And you come back and marry your girl, as the English put it. Or your misogynist used to say. Anyway, you put it off for a couple of years and you roamed around the world. She waited for you. Phil, yeah, walked around the world. 33,000 miles. 33,000 miles. I figured it out. It was 33,000 miles I walked. This fellow here was with me. This Jewish fella gets up and puts a picture from behind Joe. Joe holds the photograph in front of the video camera. Colonel Blesny and I. Of course, he couldn't go through the Middle East. He was Jewish, so they wouldn't give him a visa. So I crossed the Middle East by myself. But I met him back in London. He's my closest friend. He and I hiked around the world together except the Middle East. I was by myself there. I walked with Ken Silver and Erwin Pless all over Egypt. I met Ken at the railroad station in London and Erwin in Japan. He was a radio navigation systems expert in Japan. We were both radio navigators and built the systems for Callahan Electronics in Iowa. Well, you went just to observe, to see what you wanted to see how people lived. Phil, I learned more from the Arabs and the Bedouins than anybody. The Bedouins lived in the desert on nothing. That's what I learned most about the desert. That's where I learned most about the desert. Joe, don't you remember what Green said? Marilyn, he said his grandfather was a Bedouin. He said he loved you and his grandfather to get along. He figured you two would get along fine, even if you couldn't understand each other. He said you reminded him of his grandfather. Phil, you go into a Bedouin camp and eat yourself to death. Chuckles. You know they give you the goat's eye. I never liked that too much. The eye don't taste that good. The eye didn't taste all that good. They'd kill a goat. The eye was a delicacy. More than once I had to kind of hide it. Shows how he would get rid of it behind his back. Joe laughs. Hide it behind your neck. Phil chuckles. That's what they always gave when they welcomed the guests. Joe. They get by with very little water. They didn't have much sanitation yet. They're pretty healthy people. Phil. They know about paramagnetism. They do the same thing I did. Put some paramagnetic rock in the canteen and it wouldn't evaporate anymore. They used paramagnetic rock to keep the water from evaporating. That's interesting. Joe, the Romans took magnetite Fe3O4 and put it inside their troves that they were delivering their waters with. Phil, sure, no evaporation. They put it in the bottom of the troves. They knew that from watching streams. They could see. It's really hard to see this. I need to zoom in a little bit. From watching troves, they knew that from watching streams, they could see that not much water would evaporate from streams. They found when the rocks were out of the irrigation ditches, the water would evaporate. So they'd put rocks into the bottom of the irrigation ditches. It would stop the water from evaporating. Joe, very few people picked up on what you were doing on paramagnetic attraction to water, and yet the deserts could benefit from that more than anybody else. Phil, well, that's the beauty of how God takes care of things. I won't even talk about stuff like that when they give me the Medal of Honor. They won't make a paramagnetic speech. Then it'd get all over the world and then everybody would believe it. No problem. No problem, smiles. See, they don't experiment. If I go to the Warren experiment station and give a lecture, they'd believe it. But when it gets in a book, they don't believe it. Joe, how could they not believe it when you look at Tucson and how desert it is? It's got 12 inches of water a year. Look over here. You got 12 inches of water and look, everything green. Phil, it's green as can be. It's green as can be. Tucson doesn't absorb paramagnetics. Around here, there's no desert. It's green forest and small trees, points out the window. Those trees are only about 30 feet high, most of them. They grow out but don't grow up. They grow outward. Joe, in Mexico, let's say Guaymas has the same rain and the same temperature as Hawaii, but Hawaii's got all this green and everything else. Phil, it's all magnetic. Hawaii is a paramagnetic volcano island. Joe, it's paramagnetic volcano ash. Phil, all you gotta do, it's common sense to take a look at Hawaii and say it's a volcano. Then you go get the rocks and see what's in it. I invented the word paramagnetism because it's a weak magnetic field. Para means weak. Joe, paramagnetics is a balance. It's not about the North Pole and South Pole. It's about the balance. Phil, it's the balance of yin and yang, as the Chinese used to call it. Called it biomagnetism or paramagnetism, yin and yang, up and down. To the Chinese, yang is female magnetism and yin is the male. Joe, it's so confusing. To the English, everything they write about, the North Pole is the South Pole, and South Pole is the North Pole. And if you try to read universal stuff, you can get mixed up pretty easy. Miniature ceramic representation of Biddy's early house. Phil, our terminology got all mixed up and it drove people crazy. So they just give up on it. Because if you read one book, it's got the English terminology and the other one has the American, and yet another one has the French. So you kind of give up on it. Phil turns toward Joe and points to miniature hand-sized houses made of kin-fired clay. Those little houses, one of them is paramagnetic, and that one is Biddy Early's house. Biddy Early was one of the greatest healers that ever lived. There's no question about it. It survived many years preserved like that, and a couple generations later, they came along and just tore it down. But she was probably the greatest healer that ever lived. She had a bottle and put rocks in it. Of course, the sun would hit the bottle and the blue light would energize the rock. Then she'd give that to people and it would heal them. So that's how I figured out she was healing people. If you go to Ireland, everybody's telling you who Biddy Early is. They'd say, oh, she's a healer. She learned it all from sitting at the face of a rock and she knew it was magical. She'd take a little piece of paramagnetic rock and put it in the bottle. When she died, she threw the blue bottle in the middle of a lake. It sunk to the mud, but I spent a week down there looking for it. I never found it. It's down there in the sand, no doubt. Well, that's interesting. I want to look into her work. Joe, the blue bottle would be more likely cobalt, wouldn't it? Phil, cobalt is what it was. It was a cobalt bottle. Joe, so that goes back to Tesla's testing using cobalt coatings on aluminum, yin and yang. Phil, the ancient people put cobalt into blue bottles because they knew it would make the water healthy. So all the blue bottles were made with cobalt. Still are. Joe, goes clear back to the Eye of Alexander, doesn't it? Phil, yeah, I got a blue bottle around here somewhere. Joe, it's up on top. Joe points to the video camera to the top of the bookshelf. It is a square-shaped cobalt blue bottle. The Eye of Alexander was cobalt. After that, the Egyptians worshipped blue. Phil, blue was the sacred color for the Egyptians and Mesopotamians in general. Joe, the royalty too. Phil, the royalty and everybody. All that stuff was in the ancient religion. That picture up there, I bought it. It was by a famous Japanese artist. I found it for sale for about $100 at some store, and everybody told me it was worth $30,000 or $40,000. Japan's most famous woodcut artist. And the only way I knew it was real because I read in some ancient literature that the women used to get those for gift cards on their birthday. You'd get those on your birthday. They'd fold it into four and put it in their pocket. That's why there are 4 creases on that. Joe, that's how you can tell it's real. Phil, yeah, that's how you can tell. I bought that for a couple $100 and took it to the museum in Tokyo, and they say, oh, it's probably worth 15 or 20,000. Joe, now, paramagnetic stone that's fed to gardens. Plants can take the life energy from that while it travels within the innards. Phil, it goes right up there. It goes right up the flow of the cortex and the outer layers of the plant. Most of it is in the outer layer. The outer layer is the bark and the inner layer is the cortex. Joe, Dr. Ricketts took your paramagnetics and lignites and mixed it together to grow carrots and radishes. He would get 800 and 900% the more vitamins and minerals. And the iron oxide, Phil, it takes your vitamins and makes them 10 times better. Joe, so most of the food we're getting now has 1/10 the vitamins and minerals. Phil, that's why you're better off eating green vegetables. Vegetables used to have vitamins, but now only your organics have them. Most of the vegetables grown are organic green vegetables, so most of it is safe. This country has gone organic. Joe, when iron oxide gets into these plants, it becomes collective of solar energy. It becomes hot. Paramagnetic iron oxide gets 10 times hotter than any other dirt or soil around it. So that energy is transferred. Phil, that's why if you take one of these little balls and roll it around your hand, it gets hot. It's not your hand warming the ball, it's the ball warming your hand. It takes energy right out of the atmosphere. Joe, we were talking about this lady that was taking paramagnetic rocks and putting it in a blue bottle. It would then structure the water. Phil, yeah, the sunlight enters the bottle passing through the cobalt blue glass and energizes the water that surrounds the paramagnetic rock. The sunlight in the room, it doesn't matter if it's inside or out, enters the bottom and stores energy in the paramagnetic water. It's like a radio system. It stores it. The radio has stored energy. It puts a signal up to the transmission station, stores it, then puts it right back down. All electronics have stored energy. Joe, energy, we're not really measuring it at all. energy. We're not really measuring it at all. There's probably more energies than we realize out there. There's fifth energies and sixth energies. Phil, I discovered another thing. It's called paramagnetics. They didn't even know much about that. They didn't know it existed. It's a weak electromagnetic energy that nobody considers. I named it paramagnetics because it's like a parachute. It's a weak thing. Parachutes don't weigh much, but it'll keep you from getting killed when you jump out of an airplane. It's a weak energy. Joe, now when you heat paramagnetic energy at high temperatures, it changes. It doesn't have the magnetic attraction, but there's still another energy there. What's that one? Phil, it's infrared. No question about that. When you heat it up, you generate infrared. You got paramagnetism that is a transmitter, and infrared is the signal that's going out. Paramagnetism is an object itself. What it does, it takes the infrared energy that comes out in the infrared spectrum. So you got 62 angstroms, 82 angstroms, 99.6, 62.8 angstroms. You get them all lined up and you'll find out that those are the ones that are all healthy. You get the wrong ones and you find they're poisons. Phil raises his hand and brings them together, aligning his fingers from his left to the right. He's demonstrating an alignment when he shifts the fingers of both hands slightly spun off center to show a misalignment. These are the angstroms that are tuned, and these are the ones out of mesh. Joe, that's what Halstead was worried about, that these terrorists got the tunement and could actually take a frequency and put a pail underneath an aspirin bottle, then tell you what aspirin was in the bottle. But they could also tune it to a bad frequency, making it poisonous. Phil, yeah, you can take any medicine and put it into a blue bottle and place it in the sun. If you sit by it, it'll cure you as fast as taking it. That's interesting. Marilyn, you said cure you, not kill you. Phil, cure you. Well, if it's a good energy, like perfume, it'll cure you. But if it's a toxic frequency, it'll injure you. Joe, now, so this is going to Pastor's work. Phil, he didn't know about the physics of it, but he knew what he was doing. Joe, he called it memory. Phil, everything has memory. The plate on the wall has memory. Joe, if you're cleaning water, dirty water won't pick up memory. It has to be clean first. It has to be clean water. But if it's a paramagnetic clean water that's run over iron crystals, then it'll capture an image just like an audio and visual tape. Phil, you can take a laser and focus it on the image of the falcon on the plate there. He points to a decorative plate across the room. And the image will float right out there in the room. Yeah, you can take a laser, which is coherent energy, which means the waves are going out together instead of separately. You can point that at any picture, and that energy, that picture, will float out here in the room. Joe, that's why you point a laser at the moon. You want concentrated in a straight line. Phil, when a laser leaves the Earth, it's about 1 millimeter across. But when it gets to the moon, it's about 1 inch across. It doesn't expand any. It doesn't spread much. The atmosphere scatters the photons, which is why it spreads a little. Joe, so when Dr. Benson was working on, he had to use quartz lenses or lights or tubes. He put the magnets on the backside and then put the magnetite iron onto the side and then shot the laser through the quartz. He couldn't do it through glass. He had to use quartz. Phil, had to do it with quartz because glass won't work. Glass is a mixture of everything, and quartz is a pure crystal. Joe, so he's got the frequencies going right through the end of the iron, and when the water flowed over the iron, it would clean. Now he told me one thing. He said, Joe, go drill a hole on the top of a pipe on the road somewhere close to this and put a piece of Gore-Tex. He said Gore-Tex will let the gas go, but it won't let the water through. Phil, that all came from me. I used to fill polyethylene tubes with it and drive it to the ground to grow big trees and plants. You can drive the tubes into kiln-fired pots or in the ground to grow your plants that way. I had a garden like that one time, Joe. I can't remember the fellow's name. He had a place called Union Gardens, he called it. Phil. Hugh Lowell is his name, Joe. Yeah, Lowell had one of the most beautiful stuff I'd seen in my life. What he was doing was taking rusty pipes, closing the bottom and filling it halfway with magnetite with a crystal in the middle, and filling the rest with the top. And at the top, he had a screw and would turn that down, putting pressure on it. He had some of the most beautiful plants I've ever seen in my life. Phil, I did talks on that. Joe, I know you know the man. He's from Brightonsville, Georgia, and he's got Union Gardens. Phil, what's his name? I can't think of his name. Joe, I'm trying to think of his name too. Phil, Connors or something? Joe, Connors was that woman. No, that was right next door. Connors is that woman who had the visions. Phil, yeah, but her name, Nancy Fowler was her name. Joe, Nancy Fowler. I went over and visited 2 or 3 days with her, and they had a migration come over there of Catholics from all over the world. They had so many people that they didn't have any place for them to go to the bathroom, so they brought in close to 50 toilets, porta potties, and they were people arriving in Greyhound buses from thousands of miles around. She was a very simple woman, very nice. Phil, she was a close friend of mine. I'll bet they tried to shut her down when I went up there. He changed his mind in a hurry and started preaching about her. Joe, I was impressed by her. Phil, oh, she's for real. Joe, Christopher Bird lived just a little ways from there. Remember when I brought those papers from there? Marilyn, and her message was very simple too. Winnie, very, very simple. Joe, I was so impressed by her. And there were all those people coming in on buses. It must have made her mad. There must have been a couple 100 buses. Winnie, and they all wanted to see her. Joe, they all wanted to see her. Phil, and all you had to do was by yourself and all you had to do was be yourself and quit being uptight. Just be playful like it's a big game. Joe, now, she didn't have any special education. It's as if she was tuning in. Winnie, she was tuning into God. Marilyn, she is a nurse. Phil, she was a nurse. Joe, I told you I had these pads that I made with paramagnetics and took them to the hospice where people were dying. I took hundreds of them to these people. They liked them. And particularly if I put them in the freezer to get them cold, I'd steal them. I'd steal them because it didn't work. They'd stink. The doctors would come along and throw them away. Phil, the chemical doctors. I'm going to stop here at 92 because I have 1 minute to clock into work. All right, page 92. We'll take it next time.